From the Aspen Institute in Aspen, Colorado, this is day one of the 2020 Aspen Ideas Festival. From the Institute campus, the co-founder of the Aspen Ideas Festival, Vice President of Public Programs for the Aspen Institute, Kitty Boone.
Hello, welcome to the Aspen Ideas Festival. I'm Kitty Boone, and I'm on the campus of the Aspen Institute in Aspen, Colorado. It sits on the ancestral land of the Ute people who have celebrated over hundreds of years and still today its beauty and bounty. Each June for the last 16 years, this has been the site of the Aspen Ideas Festival. This festival reflects the kinds of convenings we have hosted at the Aspen Institute over the last 70 years. We aspire to gather individuals with diverse perspectives in order that we learn and engage with one another in a civil way and navigate society's biggest challenges. Starting today and over the next 5 nights, we have gathered remarkable experts and leaders discussing climate, economics, politics, democracy, and racial justice. Most importantly, while you're not here to discuss in person, we would love you to leave each evening of conversation with fresh ideas to consider.
The first day of the festival features Aspen Ideas conversations between Brittany Packnett-Cunningham and Stacey Abrams, Darren Walker and David Byrne, in addition to Elizabeth Cohen with Dr. Anthony Fauci. And we'll hear 3 leaders sharing big ideas. And now, our first Aspen Ideas conversation with Brittany Packnett-Cunningham and Stacey Abrams.
I'm Brittany Packnett-Cunningham. I am an educator, an activist, and a writer, and this is Aspen Ideas. I am so excited that we get to be in conversation with the one and the only leader, Stacey Abrams. She is the former minority leader of the Georgia State House of Representatives. She is the founder of both Fair Fight and Fair Count, focusing on ensuring that we vote and that we're counted in the census. And she is an all-around bad Black woman. Thank you so much for joining us, Leader Abrams.
Brittany, it is my honor to be in conversation with you.
I know that we have seen each other in so many places, and usually it's a 30-second chat, a 60-second chat, but we really get to dive deep today, and I think that this is the time to be doing it. We are standing on the precipice of such incredible transformation, and I know I am preaching to the choir here because you have been in the middle of so much of it. But we are really experiencing the confluence of events, right? We are experiencing most certainly a pandemic, a righteous rebellion and revolution against racial injustice. And we have seen so many of the inequities and injustices that already existed not be erased by that confluence of events, but be highlighted and exacerbated by that confluence of events. I'm really excited to talk to you in this moment, though, because what we have before us is not just a set of profound inequities, but a profound opportunity to move forward. And as the deepest inequities in our society have been laid bare in this moment, I really want to know from you, how are you thinking about both what this moment is telling us about who we are and what this moment is calling us to be?
So you ask really simple questions.
Well, you're brilliant. I'm trying to get all of it out.
I begin by thinking about why I do the work I do, why you do the work you do. It is not because we believe in instant results. We know that these are tedious, heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching issues that we have to grapple with. But we also know that progress is possible. It just tends to be accompanied by these moments of regression and by an amazing amount of tension around what should be. People agree that we need to move, but there isn't always common agreement about what that looks like, what it sounds like, the shape it has to take, and how quickly it can happen. I recently wrote a book that came out in the month of June, and the title, in my unexpectedly, I think is a bit prophetic, which is that our time is now. And where I stand in this conversation is that we're at inflection points on so many things. As you mentioned, the COVID pandemic is an inflection point that reveals the historical inequities, particularly in the allocation of healthcare and resources in communities of color. We have watched as Blacks have had double the rate of COVID infection and death, but we also know that the economic perils associated are also hitting our communities hardest. But I also remember listening to and talking to the Navajo Nation that had the 3rd highest infection rate because of the disinterest that we have seen from this administration. We know that Latino rates of infection are going up and that no community is immune. And so we're at this inflection point where we have to talk about what it means to be American and to take care of one another. At the same time, we're grappling with the conversation about police brutality, which is a symptom of a larger system of racism. And so I don't want us to get caught in this notion that if we reform the behaviors of brutality, we have now fixed the problem. I talk about it as reformation and transformation. We are in a nation where reformation is going to have to be a part of what we do. We are not at a place where everyone agrees with the fact that we have to fix everything, but we are at a moment where there is common cause about fixing the most egregious. But we also have to then hold our leaders accountable for making sure there is a transformational conversation that happens at the same time, and we don't allow reformation to displace or overshadow the responsibility of transformation.
I think that's so critically important, not allowing reformation to overshadow the possibility and the conversation and the work that it will take to engage in transformation. I want to talk to you a little bit, though, about what you were referring to in terms of the roots of the issues, right? You are a daughter of Mississippi. That is also where my people come from, on my dad's side of the family. And when I think about the work that our ancestors had to do, the ways in which they had to envision and imagine a future that they could not touch yet, and that some of them didn't even live to see, I am inspired, I am motivated, I recognize my privilege in this moment, and I recognize my responsibility. How have your roots led you to a place where you are engaged in this fight no matter what it takes?
I get asked often the question of what are you optimistic about? What gives you hope? And I think back to the fact that my parents are examples of progress. My mom is the only one of her siblings to finish high school. My dad is the first man in his family to go to college. And he went to college despite having dyslexia that was undiagnosed until he was in his 30s. So my dad had to memorize his way through school. My mom had to fight her way through life. But their parents were domestic workers and cooks. My great-grandparents were sharecroppers, and before that, slaves. And so we have to think about the fact that the progress it sometimes feels plotting and mean, but it is real. And I had this privilege in 2018 to become the first Black woman to be the gubernatorial nominee for a major party in American history. I may not have gotten the job, but there is something about coming from the roots of Mississippi, being in the deep South state of Georgia, and being able to say that this is the progress we've made. My understanding of this moment is that I don't have the luxury of giving up, because the slaves that birthed me, they did not have the chance to give up. The grandparents and great-grandparents who fought for the right to vote, who fought for the right to be seen and be respected, my parents who were civil rights activists as teenagers, they raised me to say, you fix the problems. You don't simply get to lament, you have to do. And that obligation, that responsibility is what drives me every day.
I always say that our ancestors did far more with far less. So who are we to stop now? I could not agree with you more. And when we talk about the doing of this moment, the action that we need to be engaged in, each and every one of us, whether you are involved in politics, you run a household, a church, whatever it is, action is needed in this moment. And I think that because of the work of you and so many others that we've seen over the last few generations, but in particular over the last few years, this America, the world, is now at a moment where folks are taking action. We see people joining anti-racist book clubs. We see folks deciding to curate their social media very differently and audit who they're listening to and bring in new voices. We see leaders and thinkers being able to sell books that they have never been able to put atop a bestsellers list, right? So we see people beginning to take action. And we know that there are multiple kinds of action that is necessary right now. I talk often about the importance of protest and policy, not or policy or protest and then policy. We understand that all of these actions work together. But back to your race, because you took action and you put yourself in the arena. And for those of us who watched, I mean, I was even down at Spellhouse Homecoming passing out leaflets, right? I mean, so many of us were excited and engaged and so hopeful in that moment. And then to watch the outcome of that election was deeply frustrating for so many of us who said, yes, there's been progress and we're going to put our hand to the plow and continue this action. But what we saw in Georgia during your race is not new, right? It is what we experienced was the latest in a long line of the kind of disenfranchisement and suppression that has been rooted in this country for a long time. So help us understand exactly how we got here. That if 2020 is just the latest chapter in this book, how did we get to this place where voter suppression, voter disenfranchisement is still a part of the conversation?
We have to think about this in two spheres. We have sort of pre-21st century voter suppression and post-21st century voter suppression. From the inception of our country, we had a voter suppression model that was baked into the system. The Constitution is an act of voter suppression. It said that, yes, you have this right to vote, but it then disenfranchised every community except for white men. And even within that, only landed white men were really able to vote. But blacks were not human, Native Americans were not citizens, women were silent, and the 1790 Naturalization Act ensured that nobody else was coming or could access the perquisites of citizenship. You fast forward through, time and the anguish of the Civil War, you get to the 15th Amendment that, yes, gives blacks the right to vote, but it gives black men the right to vote. And what it also does is it devolves, as it always has, it devolves to the states the right to administer elections. And so by the time the Reconstruction has ended, the states have the authority to rescind what the Constitution has given, led by the Mississippi Plan, which basically said, we're no longer going to say you can't vote because you're black. We're going to create all of these other ways to impede the 15th Amendment's adoption. You have the 19th Amendment that gave white women the right to vote, but not black women. And it wasn't until 1965 that we truly had the right to vote for all people. And even then, there were still impediments for Latinos and Native Americans, and that took the 1975 reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. So you have this long arc of history, and around 1975, we start to see true engagement. We start to see true evolution. But then we run into 2008, when way too many people of way too many backgrounds decided they deserved to be heard and elected Barack Obama, and that started the 21st century wave of voter suppression. That was when we saw North Carolina eliminate Sunday voting because too many black people used it. We saw states across the country start to cordon off who had access. And then we had the coup de grace, which was the 2013 Voting Rights Act evisceration by the Supreme Court. When that happened, it gave carte blanche to every state that once operated with this ignominious belief that blacks should not be heard. They were able to now use administrative rules and barriers to voting with this, semi-facially neutral methodology, but they were able to block the right to vote. And this is how they do it. Through voting. So can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot, and does your ballot get counted? And we know that across the country, both the former Confederate states and states that simply do not like the evolving composition of their electorate, we have seen states put in place these rules and barriers. We know that in Texas, you can vote with your gun license, but you can't vote with your student ID. In Wisconsin, you have to have someone witness your absentee ballot, even in the midst of a quarantine. In Florida, we have the challenge of absentee ballots being rejected at a higher rate. And in Georgia, we have just the wholesale breakdown of the systems. But this is a national crisis that is solvable, but only when we understand that because federal government devolves to the states the right to administer elections, we can't solve it simply at the federal level. We have to understand state by state how voter suppression works. But it all has the same architecture. Stopping you from registering and staying on the rolls, stopping you from casting a ballot, and if they can't get that done, making sure your ballot doesn't count.
And when you talked about voting in your book, Our Time Is Now, which I agree is aptly named, you said that voting is an act of faith. It is profound, and in a democracy, it is the ultimate power. We are now currently talking about all of these incremental fixes that need to happen that are hugely substantial, but it is piece by piece, moment by moment, state by state, as you're saying, not just at the federal level. And for so many folks, they can get bogged down in the weight of doing that and how long it takes and how detailed it is and how closely you have to be paying attention to things you may not have even been thinking about. But you call voting the ultimate power. So this is Aspen Ideas. When you think about your most radical imagination about what the state of democracy and what voting can truly look like in this country, beyond all of the piecemeal details, what do you see? What is our greatest aspiration in that space? What are we working toward?
So I want us to do what we know works, which is same-day registration, universal automatic registration, the elimination of prison disenfranchisement. We need to ensure that at the age of 17, you are automatically pre-enrolled to become a voter the moment you become 18. We have to have the full panoply of opportunities. Vote by mail, but we know that not everyone wants to vote by mail, so making sure we have vote by mail, in-person early voting, and voting on election day. We need voting centers that can minimize the necessity for precincts so people can't be pushed out of the process because the place closest to them shuts down. Give them a place where they know if they can get there, they can vote. But we also have to wrap into this a decade-long push towards the census. Every single decade, we forget that this incredible instrumentality of our future is going to be put to work. And then we scramble in the last couple of years trying to make it work. And as we know, the hardest to count communities are the ones that are the most desperate for this progressive power, for this access to democracy, and they're kept out of the process and out of the conversation. In this year, it's been weaponized by the Trump administration in ways we have never seen before. But we know that as the country continues to change, as demography drives us towards a diversity we have never seen before, the census is always going to be seen as dangerous to those who want to keep us as an homogenous nation. And so we have to not just think about the act of voting, but we have to think about how the inputs of voting, what happens in the census decides the political districts from school board to Congress. And so we also have to believe that the census is an annual responsibility, that every year we're talking about it, demystifying it, explaining it, and connecting it to the decisions made. Whether it's the lack of PPE in communities of color because they were undercounted a decade ago, or whether it's the fact that a school board member gets elected in a district that is not representative of the population that he or she tries to serve. We have to be able to think broadly and long term, but we know what the mechanics are. We just have to own them and push them forward and remove artificial barriers.
So can I keep it real with you for just a second?
Yes.
I want to ask a question for all of the folks that I love and care about deeply, that I know you do too, who are not choosing between one candidate or another. They are not choosing between voting yes or no on a ballot measure. They are choosing between whether or not they're going to stay on their couch because a system that has always counted them out is not going to change anytime soon, and whether or not they will go and stand at the ballot box, not actually fully believing that this system will work for them. And I think so often we have conversations about voting without recognizing the legitimacy of that complaint, the legitimacy of that frustration. There are folks who've been told we can vote our way to freedom that still aren't free. So they feel like they've been sold a bill of goods, and they look at a system that was never built for them to succeed in the first place, as you have so eloquently laid out. And they're saying, why should I participate? I've been suffering for this long and still figuring out how to make it. So is this actually going to have any effect? What do we say to those folks in our lives who have legitimate frustrations with this system, but who we need to participate anyway?
We begin by saying you're right, that voting is hard, it's tedious, and it is not a panacea. This voting isn't a magic pill, and there is no savior candidate that you're going to pick who's going to make the world perfect. It's just not going to happen. Politicians are human. They are people who are frail and who make mistakes, and they are going to fail you, even the ones you love the most. So we first need to admit that. But then we need to understand that voting is more like chemotherapy and radiation treatment. Racism is a disease. Systemic inequities, that is a cancer that has metastasized in our world. And so our responsibility is to recognize that the act of voting it's radiation therapy, but it's going to hurt. It's not always going to work. And the evil that you're trying to excise, that cancer, is going to metastasize and recur. And so if you think that if you do it a few times then it's going to get better, it's not. But we have to stop lying to people and telling them that that's what happens. I run for office not because I believe the only way to solve the problems is to be in office, but I know it's one of the best ways to make people do the things I think we should do. But it's why when I'm not in office, I'm always running organizations and building infrastructure, because I know voting isn't enough, but it is an essential part of the process. And when we abdicate that part of the process, everything else we're doing has less effect. And so it's like having to take a combo of drugs. We've got to take the voting. We've got to take the protest. We've got to take the census. We've got to protest and we've got to demonstrate, but we've got to protest at the ballot box, protest in the streets, and we have to make certain that the resources we need to keep the protest alive come to us through the census. And so what I want people to understand is that there is no one-shot fix. And yes, you are absolutely right that you have not been told the truth. The truth is this: it can get better, but it will not get better if we abdicate our responsibility. I don't vote because I believe it changes the world. I vote because I know silence absolutely doesn't.
That's it right there. So we only have time for one more question. And honestly, this is a selfish question because it's the question I keep asking myself. It is the question that Dr. King so famously titled his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? We've had conversations about what the problem looks like, about the many ways that the cancer of racism and systemic oppression metastasizes and manifests in our lives, not just in America, but around the world. So what do we do about it? There are folks who say a lot of the primaries are already over. There are folks who don't actually trust their local, state, or federal government to create the kind of systems that will keep them safe during voting in a COVID world. There are folks who look at the entire system beyond voting and again say, this was never built with me in mind, so I'm just going to disengage. And there are folks who are trying to pull those folks back in, but are struggling on exactly how to do that. So where do we go from here? What are the actions that all of us who are watching need to take from this point forward?
So I think of the world in tertiary ways. One, we have to vote. And if you have questions, I created an organization called Fair Fight 2020. It's a national organization to help protect the right to vote. We have used the primaries to help us understand the broken pieces across 18 states. But if we understand those 18 states, we really do understand what's happening in the country. So visit fairfight2020.com to get more information. The census is essential because we're not just rerunning the 2016 election, we are rerunning the 2010 election. And that's the election that decides the whole game. It decides who writes the maps for the next decade. If you thought the last 10 years were hard, don't participate. So make certain we fill out the census. $1.5 trillion worth of allocated economic power and the political power of a decade. And then 3, we have to fight for policy, because it doesn't matter if you elect folks if you don't hold them accountable for doing the things you demand. So we shouldn't just demonstrate in this moment. We need to be demonstrating when city council members are voting on a budget. We need to demonstrate when the state legislature is huddled over appropriations, but you also need to be in the Ways and Means Committee looking at their tax policy. We need to understand that government is not the president and the Congress. It is your state legislature. It is your governor. It is your mayor. It's your city council. These are the people who control the dynamics of our future. And if we hold them accountable by demanding not just policy, but policy implementation, policy accountability, and policy makers who see us, that is how we make forward. That's where we go from here.
That's the work. Let's go get free. Leader Stacey Abrams, thank you so much for your time. And more importantly, thanks for everything you do.
Thank you. It's been delightful.
Thank you, Stacey and Brittany, and thank you for joining us here at the 2020 Aspen Ideas Digital Festival, which is generously underwritten by Allstate, Mount Sinai Health System, Prudential, the Walton Family Foundation, and supported by PayPal and the Rise Fund. Our day began with Kitty Boone in Anderson Park, which makes it a fitting destination for our first campus tour. Anderson Park is a park made of a series of earthworks and open spaces specifically created for play and meditation. Designed in 1973, it was one of Bauhaus designer Herbert Bayer's final creations for the Aspen Institute campus, and the unifying element of his grand design, a place where visitors can climb, sit, and relax on elevated berms and along water features. Dedicated in honor of the Institute's second president, Robert O. Anderson, Anderson Park is a bridge between the east and west ends of campus, between the residential side and the Institute's workspaces. It's a park meant to balance labor and rest for the pursuit of mind, body, and spirit. Every year, we ask leaders to share a big idea with our attendees at the opening session in Greenwald Pavilion.
What indeed is the big idea? Resolve to make sure today's young minds are nourished completely and that their spirits are encouraged to fly.
My big idea is that players own the game.
My big idea is that we face a crisis in empathy and that we can cure it with conversation.
That tradition will continue as we've asked leaders this year from around the globe to share a big idea with you. This year, our first big idea is from Neil Katyal.
I'm Neil Katyal, a professor at Georgetown, and my big idea is that Supreme Court arguments should be televised. You know some of the benefits of this already. That's why you're listening to this talk and watching it, not just reading it. And that's just a measly talk. At the Supreme Court, you see advocates and justices debating respectfully the hardest issues of the day. At a time when the country is torn apart by race, by coronavirus, the Supreme Court points to a different way. We can disagree with each other, even profoundly, but learn how to come together with shared respect for all. I've argued 41 cases there. Each time, there are only 50 seats for the public. I wish you could see what I see. I see 9 justices who are working their tails off, asking the hard questions. I see the only branch of government that truly works. Televising the court would promote faith in our government and induce Americans to fight for the other 2 branches to work as deliberately and thoughtfully as the court does. This is the People's Court. It doesn't belong to the justices, it belongs to you.
Founding member of Talking Heads, David Byrne, is joined by Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, for today's second Aspen Ideas Festival conversation presented by Aspen Ideas Health.
I'm Darren Walker, and I'm so delighted to have David Byrne with me this afternoon. David, you are an icon, an artist, an activist, a great humanist, and intellectual. Tell me during these times why art matters and the role of artists during difficult social times like we're experiencing today.
Thank you, Darren. It's a pleasure talking to you. Great to meet you. It's not an easy question. I thought maybe you would answer that question for me. I often ask myself, can art make a difference? Can it actually change minds? I know that, for example, music can unite people. It can make people feel that they belong, that they're not alone. People hear music either with a group of people or even just alone at home, and they recognize something in a piece of music, in a song or some other piece of music, and they go, that speaks to me. There's other people out there who are like me. I experienced that as a young person. I continue to experience that when I hear new things that people have done, and it connects with me, and it makes me feel that I'm not alone in the world. I may not know the other people that I feel connected with, but I feel like I'm not alone. That's an incredible thing. That's not speaking to a specific issue, a policy, or anything like that, but it's about giving me a reason to go on, a reason to continue with my own life and feel confident about myself. Whether, let's say, okay, I'm going to stick with music for a minute. Whether music can address, let's say, social issues, that is really tough. That's a tough one for me to know the answer to. I feel that, one way I think it can do that is by example. I did a run of a show on Broadway recently, and the performers and we were a diverse group, and the way that we performed, the manner of performance and the choreography and the presentation was in some ways more, let's say, democratic than what a normal, conventional musical performance.
And this is American Utopia.
Yes, that's the name of the show. And I realized at that point that what was being communicated was not necessarily in the words of the songs, but it was in what people were seeing. We were putting in front of them a kind of evidence of that things could be different than the way they often are. And I felt like, well, music can do that. That's something that music and performance can do. We provide sometimes the evidence of what's possible.
But music can help heal too. Music can help nourish the soul and make it possible to be hopeful. Musicians have for decades, years, played a role. Think about the 1960s and the role of music and musicians. And think about your own career, which has certainly had a social activist dimension to it.
I'm never sure of the impact that my work or some others' works are having. I'm never certain of it. It's something I'd very much like to believe in, but I somehow I can't be certain. Yes, it's true that when I was younger and even today, when there are things that I hear some music, I see a performance, I see a show, see an exhibition, there are things that make me feel more connected than I was before. They'll change the way I think about things. Whether those kinds of works can directly change, say, policies, that's another matter. That I think is much harder, but I think then it works indirectly. It works through me as an audience member. As an audience member, I become changed, and I in turn, through my engagement, voting, whatever it might be, then I exert change in policy and other kinds of things.
I want to talk to you about your origins. Scotland. You end up in Rhode Island at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, where you then form this very strangely, oddly named organization, this collective called Talking Heads. How did that all come about?
It came about, it was kind of our hobby. Let me put it that way. My friends and I, we loved popular music like this, and we thought, oh, we can do that too. And it was kind of a hobby. My ambition was to be a fine artist and show in galleries and do all that kind of thing. And I moved to New York, and that was my ambition. But at the same time, I was writing songs and rehearsing with my friends. And obviously, that took over. That reached an audience and the other thing did not in the same kind of way, or at least not immediately.
So you were a college dropout, David?
Yes, I didn't finish. I tried to finish. I dropped out for a while, and I tried to go back in, and I showed the teachers the work that I'd been doing. I continued making work, and they said, no, we don't teach the kind of things you're doing. You should go to New York. You should just give it a try, which was actually disappointing, but really good advice. Anyway, I thought that maybe the reason the music succeeded was because I didn't take it, it wasn't like this intense ambition. I was doing it for the love of it.
So you didn't want to be successful. You never thought to yourself, I want to be an artist all over the world who is known for doing amazing art.
I didn't think that was possible. I thought that was way outside the realm of possibilities. I thought,
why?
I just thought because there's people who go to school, who have training, who have innate talent, who are just more gifted than I am at this. This is a skill. I don't know if I'm as skillful as a lot of other people, but I enjoy doing this. It gives me a lot of pleasure. So I'm going to continue doing it. And I thought maybe that's one of the reasons I succeeded, because I did it out of love rather than having this grand plan of a successful career.
But you had setbacks. Talk about the setbacks, because a lot of people would say you've just been stunningly successful.
I have been lucky. I have been lucky.
Always
successful. I haven't always been successful. I've been sometimes very lucky, being in the right place at the right time. There's times when I made musical decisions. Let's say there was a period when I recorded and toured with a lot of Latin musicians, with some Brazilian musicians. Some of that creatively was maybe more successful than others, but I took a fair amount of flack for that.
Why?
I think it was, I'd become fairly successful doing the Talking Heads, doing the kind of rock music, rock funk, whatever you want to call it. I'd become kind of successful doing that, developed a following, and here I was kind of abandoning them. And I think their feelings were hurt. Like, you can't just walk away from us.
Right, but as an artist, you can't be about giving the audience just more of what they want. You were on a journey. Your own interior was being put out there on the stage.
Absolutely.
Changing.
My belief was that the more I'm allowed to experiment and fail, the more you're actually going to like me if you give me enough time. You're going to see something better than if I just stick to the one thing. I think that's true, but you do run against. I can understand people have hurt feelings. They feel like they've invested in you, and then you're kind of walking away from them because you want to do something else, and which I did. But
you got new fans when you did that.
I did. I have, for example, a lot of friends in South America now.
I would imagine.
Yes. Okay, now I got to ask you about you. You grew up in Lafayette, Louisiana. And I was there once on New Year's. I saw Clifton Chenier, who was playing in a club on New Year's and in Lafayette. It was pretty amazing. So I'm curious, how did you begin to get interested in the arts and performance and the thing? Your life path?
I was very lucky because we left Lafayette. I was born in the Lafayette Charity Hospital, and like lots of poor African Americans of that time, there was not much opportunity. And my mother smartly moved my sister and myself and her to a small town in Texas. My grandmother worked as a maid for a family in Houston. And I would occasionally accompany her when she did housework, and I would do work around the house and cut the family's yard. But one of the great treasures that I found was in their area of the house where they put the trash. There were magazines that were thrown away, and those magazines often had arts and programs from theater and things that the family did. And then when I went to the University of Texas, I saw for the first time the Dance Theater of Harlem. And I was transfixed. And I also was lucky enough to come to New York after law school and immediately fell in love with an art dealer. And he had a great eye for art and taught me so much And I have just come to see the arts as integral to my own humanity. And I do believe, I think you said it so correctly, that the arts can speak when you can't speak. When my dear David died, I was so grief-stricken, I was not able to really communicate effectively. But what I did find was in the words of Kipling and Whitman and Langston Hughes, I found words that could express my own grief and pain. And so I do believe that the arts can provide you with language for experiences that you really cannot, whether they are exhilarating experiences or grief-filled experiences, can provide you with the language to express that and to also receive it.
When you moved from Lafayette, was let's say your mother, was she thinking she was moving to a place where there might be more opportunity, presumably both for her and you? I'm imagining she's also was thinking about your future.
She was thinking all about my future. And
yes.
My mother, I think, was very ambitious for me, most certainly. And I felt that, although she was not able to give me specific instructions on, well, this is where you go to college and this is what you major in. She was very specific about do your best, and also very specific about modeling the kinds of character and comportment that one has to be successful in this society, particularly if you're Black and gay. There are ways in which you have to navigate and negotiate, which are not always understood. Well, your parents, talk about you in Scotland. Scotland's a lot different from Lafayette, Louisiana, and Ames, Texas.
Very different. Yeah, very different than Lafayette. There's some similarities. Scotland, the main industry had been shipbuilding, and that had collapsed. So there was very little work. My father had training as an engineer, and American companies were hiring. And so there's some similarities. He saw, here's an opportunity for my family to have a better future if I move, if I bring them with me, which is what he did. Scotland has improved since then, but at that time, it was a pretty bleak place.
But fast forward to my watching you with the Brooklyn Youth Chorus. Do you remember that concert?
Oh my
God,
yes.
Was amazing, David.
Yeah,
it was amazing.
Wonderful.
And you've done this work with your foundation. Would you talk about the organization you started?
Yes, I started a nonprofit called Arbutus, and I did it in a way to formalize, to find a formal structure for things that I was interested in doing, to make that maybe more rigorous, that we had to kind of, if we were involved in doing something, we had to be sure that we were doing it right, and then we were staying true to the path and true to the ideas. One of the projects is called Reasons to be Cheerful. It's a kind of solutions journalism magazine online, and we look for evidence of good things that have happened, good things that have been done, not just say someone who has donated money for a hospital. We're looking for more for like changes in policy, changes in behavior that are kind of long lasting and that can be copied by other places. So if there's, let's say, for example, if Singapore has solved many of the problems of housing, let's say, maybe not all, but many, we want to look at that and go, is that something we should be looking at? Is that something we should copy? Should we be getting inspiration from a place like that, or a city, another place? Anyway, that's what that is, and I felt like I had to do it. It's one of those things I felt like I had to do. I'd get up, like a lot of us, I'd get up in the morning and read the papers and end up angry, cynical, depressed, and I thought, this can't go on. So
it can't go on because you are David Byrne and you're not an angry, hopeless person. In fact, in closing, I want you to tell me why you are hopeful. What gives you hope? What reasons of hope does David Byrne see in this moment?
I want to ask you the same thing. I want to ask you what you're seeing that's making you hopeful at this moment. I see things, a lot of those kinds of things. I see, at this particular moment, I see people's thinking about things that they weren't thinking about before.
Such as?
They're just thinking, they think about diversity. They're kind of aware of the lack of diversity in a lot of places. I also think of things, I had a discussion with a friend the other day, because as a lot of discussions, complaining about how horrible things are at the moment. And I said, but things can change. Look, think about gay marriage. 10 years, 20 years ago, if you'd have said gay marriage will be a common thing, nobody will think anything of it. It won't seem unusual. 20 years ago, you would have said, no, that's never going to happen in my lifetime. It has happened.
Well, we're seeing it happen today. I'm hopeful because I believe for the first time in our history, many white Americans are coming to grips with the anti-Black racism that has been imbued in our culture and has harmed the progress of this nation for so many years. And I'm hopeful because I believe that most white Americans don't want to live in a racist America. They want to live in an America that provides opportunity for all of us. And hope is the oxygen of democracy. And if our democracy is to flourish, we all have to be hopeful. And I see reasons for hope. And of course, David, this conversation is one of the reasons I'm hopeful about our future, because I know that people like you are hard at work using your artistry, your creativity, and your commitment to justice to make this world better. And I will close by reminding us of something that Dr. Martin Luther King said in 1968 to his friend Harry Belafonte. He said, "America's house is on fire. Where are her firefighters?" David Byrne, you are one of America's firefighters. I'm so happy that you and I had this opportunity, and thankful to the Aspen Institute that we could be a part of their great Ideas Festival 2020. Thank you, David Byrne.
Thank you, Darren Walker.
Thank you for joining us here at the 2020 Aspen Ideas Digital Festival, which is generously underwritten by Allstate, Mount Sinai Health System, Prudential, the Walton Family Foundation, and supported by PayPal and the Rise Fund. And now, another big idea.
I'm Carol Stern, Executive Director of the Walton Family Foundation. And here's our big idea. It's time to listen to our children. It's time because the social change that our world so desperately needs is too big to be carried by one generation. The Walton Family Foundation, at our core, is a family-led foundation committed to increasing access to opportunity for people and for communities. And multi-generational change is at the heart of our work. We were inspired by Sam and Helen Walton, but the work today is continued by their children, by their grandchildren, and by their spouses. And we know we are stronger when experienced leaders learn from young leaders who bring fresh ideas, fresh thinking, what's needed to solve big problems. But today, all across our nation, kids are telling us that adults are just not listening. In a Youth Truth survey, barely half of the high school students asked said that adults listen to their concerns or their ideas. And in another survey, thousands of students have informed us that only one in four report meaningful daily learning while at home during COVID. If recent actions from the kids in Parkland to the 17-year-old climate activist who spoke at the UN tell us anything, they tell us that kids are not going to take it. In our work at the Foundation, we're inspired by examples of those who are making space for youth voices. Examples such as the Education News Service, Chalkbeat, who allowed students to take over their site, or a group of Oakland students who did their own research, produced their own research to prove that they aren't getting the quality education they deserve. You know, I was asked the other day, what gives me hope? And without hesitation, I answered, young people protesting against centuries of racial injustice. Our children are standing up for what they believe in. They're speaking out for what they believe in. And it's time for us to listen.
Our next guest is someone who has been advocating for the world's public health for decades. Dr. Anthony Fauci is now joined by Elizabeth Cohen, presented by Aspen Ideas Health.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Cohen, CNN senior medical correspondent, and I have the pleasure and the honor today of interviewing and speaking with Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the NIH. Tony, it's so great to have you here with us. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, Elizabeth. Thank you for having me.
Tony, the last time you and I were together was in your office at the NIH in October. We were talking about the flu, and it seems like a million years ago. How are you doing through all this?
Well, you know, obviously it's very intense, Elizabeth. I mean, this is a historic outbreak now that has been, you know, condensed into a few months. The entire globe is involved. We're having difficult situations that we've had a couple of months ago, last month, and now we're having resurgences in certain states. So it's very intense. You know, I keep saying somewhat with tongue in cheek, but I mean it like we're running on fumes. But the fumes are pretty thick, so we've got to do it. There's a lot going on.
It's really admirable.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you mentioned these surges, and something I've been thinking about, which is when COVID first hit, we weren't even calling it COVID, right? We were calling it coronavirus. When it first hit, there were so many surprises, so many things we didn't know to do. But when you see these surges come, you know, nearly 6 months in, could some of this have been prevented?
Well, I don't think there's any question about that, Elizabeth. I mean, we got hit badly. We locked down, you know, uniformly. Some areas like the New York metropolitan area obviously got hit extremely badly. You might recall that there was a period of time when half the cases were in that metropolitan area. So what happened is that obviously it became clear that we needed to not only lock down, but figure out a way how we open up again, because you can't lock down forever, because you'll actually destroy a lot of things in society to do that. But the only way to reopen when you have the dynamics of the epidemic still, the pandemic still present, is to do it in a measured way. And we outlined that in the guidelines for opening America again, very familiar. You know, first we had what's called the gateway. You got to have the test, the cases go down. Then you go to one phase to the other. What has happened, I guess understandably, but nonetheless regrettably, that people took the attitude in some places of either all or none. Either you lock down or you just let it fly and you just ignore many of the guidelines of physical distancing, wearing a mask, shaking hands, avoiding crowds. And what happened is you see pictures on the TV of the fact that even in states that are telling their citizens to do it correctly, they're doing that. There are crowds, they're not physical distancing, and they're not wearing masks. That's a recipe for disaster. It's something I spoke about time and again. We do need to open up again, no doubt about it. We want to get the economy back, but you've got to do it in a measured way. And now we're seeing the consequences of community spread, which is even more difficult to contain than spread in a well-known physical location, like a prison or a nursing home or a meatpacking place. When you have community spread, it's insidious because there are so many people in the community who are infected but asymptomatic. It makes it extremely problematic to do efficient contact tracing because most of the people who are infected don't even know they're infected. So how do you do contact tracing when someone doesn't have any symptoms?
If you could give the country as a whole, the public health system and the country as a whole, a grade for how we have handled this outbreak, what grade would you give?
Well, it's a good question, and I like the way you framed it, Elizabeth, because we live in such a heterogeneous country. I mean, both geographically, demographically, economically, it's so different, so that it's almost unfair because if you give the country a grade, you're really neglecting those areas that did it really well, that listened, that shut down, that are opening up with care. There are others that actually didn't listen, or they jumped over these guideposts that we had. Others got hit really badly, like the metropolitan area, and are doing very well now. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the New York metropolitan area, they're doing it really well. They're slowing down. They're watching what's happening as they go from one phase to another. And when they see things that might endanger the flow and maybe precipitate an outbreak, they call a timeout and maybe come back a little. That's what everyone has to do. So some grades are going to be A+, some are going to be A, and some are going to be down in C somewhere.
Let's talk about the vaccine. There are 3 companies that are going into phase 3 clinical trials this summer. How much hope do you have that these vaccines will work and they will work well to get this outbreak under control?
Well, as you know, with vaccinology, nothing is guaranteed because you're dealing with biologics. You're injecting innocent people. You have to wait to see what the dynamics of the outbreak is if you get a good signal that it works. So with all those vicissitudes being considered, what I've seen in early data, in the animal data, and in the phase 1 data, which is primarily for safety, but you get some inkling as to whether or not you can induce the kind of immune response that you would predict would be protective. What I've seen thus far looks good. So with all the caveats that go with no guarantee, I still think that one can say that I'm cautiously optimistic that we will have one or maybe more candidates of vaccines that could be available and be effective by the end of the year, the beginning of 2021.
When you say available, do you mean I could go to my doctor or my pharmacy and get the shot by the end of this year, beginning of next year?
Yeah. Well, Elizabeth, what's different about all of this is that there is a great risk in the provision of resources. So if this were normal business as usual, no emergency, companies would not make investments in the next step until they were sure of the previous step. They wouldn't be manufacturing doses unless they knew the vaccine would work. What's happened now with major investments on the part of the federal government, that when these products reach a certain point, phase 2, early phase 3, you're going to push the button and already start manufacturing, which means that if you prove that it's effective or not, but let's assume it is, and it's December or January, by that time, you will already have a lot of doses to distribute. In fact, several of the companies, and I can't vouch for them, but they're saying it with confidence. Several of the companies are saying that by the beginning of 2020 into 2021, And into 2021, they will have hundreds of millions of doses. And after a year or so, even as many as 1 billion doses. So if that's true, and we'll take them on their word, then you and I and others could have a vaccine that we might be able to take in December or January or February.
Vaccines have different levels of efficacy. If you get 2 doses of measles vaccine, you are almost 100% protected. But, as you and I know, the flu vaccine, even on a well-matched year, is, 40 to 60% protective against, flu. Which do we think this is going to be? Is it going to be 100%? We are going to protect against this, or it might be something less than that? And if so, how much less?
Well, as you probably know the answer to your own question, Elizabeth, we don't know the answer to that right now. You've got to do the testing to find out. I doubt seriously that any vaccine will ever be 100% protected. The best we've ever done is measles, which is 97 to 98% effective. That would be wonderful if we get there. I don't think we will. I would settle for a 70, 75% effective vaccine, because that would bring you to that level of would be herd immunity level.
So I'm glad you mentioned that number, because a CNN poll and other polls have shown that in this neighborhood, about 1/3 of Americans are not going to get the vaccine. They say they're not going to get it, even if it's free and easy to get, or that they're very, very hesitant to get it. If only, say, 70, 75% of Americans are willing to get the vaccine, and it's only, say, I think you just said 70, 75% effective, is that going to get us to herd immunity?
Unlikely. And that's one of the reasons why we have to make sure we engage the community as we're doing now, to get community people to help us, for people to understand that we are doing everything we can to show that it's safe and that it's effective. And it's for the good of them as individuals and in society to take the vaccine. So we have a lot of work to do, because as you well know, we've spoken about this intensively in the past, there is a general anti-science, anti-authority, anti-vaccine feeling among some people in this country, an alarmingly large percentage of people, relatively speaking.
I mean, you just have to go on Facebook. There's so many, and those groups have really penetrated social media. How are you and other members of the public health world going to get in there and counteract what they've created? All of these lies they've created over the years, how are you going to undo that?
It's not going to be easy, Elizabeth. Anyone thinks it'll be easy is not facing reality. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to require hard work, public messaging by people who they trust. They may not like a government person in a suit like me telling them, even though I will tell them. They really need to see people that they can relate to in the community, sports figures, community heroes, people that they look up to.
And so are we working on that kind of a campaign?
Oh, absolutely. We have a program right now that's going to be extensive in reaching out to the community.
Why haven't we seen the phase 1 data? You mentioned that you've seen it. I don't believe that's been published.
It's going to be literally within days. It'll be out. Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting, the 3 vaccines that are going to be in phase 3 trials this summer, they use technology that's never been used in a vaccine that's on the market. This will be the first time. Does that give you any uneasiness or?
No, not really. I mean, Elizabeth, you know me for a long time. I'm uneasy about everything that we're not sure of, and that's the reason why we do that. I would say that I don't have a major concern about that, because it is a good technique. It is easy to scale up. The responses we're getting in the animals and in the phase 1 look really good. So, I mean, obviously, you always have a little bit concerned because it hasn't been proven over decades, but I think we'll be okay. We're also doing some of the more classic ones.
Well, the Chinese are using a very classic one that's resulted in many vaccines on the market. Everyone said it would be slow, but they're in phase 3.
Right.
Is it possible they could get a vaccine, the Chinese could get a vaccine before we do?
Oh, God bless them. I hope they do. As a matter of fact, I hope everybody that's trying to get a vaccine gets it quickly and effectively and safely. Absolutely. This isn't a competition to win a game. This is a lot of different groups from different countries trying to develop a vaccine that would be safe and effective. I mean, I often get that question, like, are you concerned that somebody's going to get it before you? Goodness, I hope everybody gets it. I don't really care what order they get it in.
And have we spoken to the Chinese have had many teams on this, more than anyone actually, in human trials. Has the U.S. spoken to them and said, hey, let's come up with a plan for sharing in case, you finish first, we finish first?
Well, there's always that. I mean, we're on a phone call every week with the WHO umbrella group, and the Chinese are there. These are colleagues I've known for years and years. We talk to each other all the time.
Okay. So I've thought of you so many times during this outbreak, Tony, because our conversation in October, our conversations over the years, you have devoted your life to fighting these outbreaks. Your work with HIV, your work with H1N1, that all speaks for itself. And I've wondered, how have you felt watching our country get into the situation that it's in right now?
Well, it's difficult to see that. I think what people don't understand, that there are things that we could have done better, and there are things that are beyond our control that have made it much more difficult for us. We are a very big country. We have great heterogeneity. Some countries that can do things in a unidimensional way, it's very difficult to do that here. We have a culture that isn't necessarily matched to many of the other countries. The federalism, the states need to do things the way they want to do it. So there's the tension often between direction from the central to the implementation at the state level. That's not an excuse, but there are a lot of things that make how we respond different than how other countries respond. There are a lot of things that we're really very happy with, very excited about, very proud of, and there are certainly things we could have done better. I mean, anybody who denies that is not looking at what's actually going on.
Contact tracing is such an important pillar of getting rid of an outbreak or getting an outbreak under control. I've spoken to many people who've been diagnosed with COVID. Not one of them was contacted for contact tracing. How do you think we're doing with contact tracing?
I don't think we're doing very well for a number of reasons, not all of which is the fault of the system. In that, I mentioned this over the past few days, that if you go into the community and call up and say, how's the contact tracing going? The dots are not connected because a lot of it is done by phone. You make a contact, 50% of the people, because you're coming from an authority, don't even want to talk to you. If you're in an area where there are a lot of brown people who are Latinx at the border, they're concerned if you give them confidential information, it's going to work against them. And then there are those who they'll give you the contact, but you don't exactly isolate them. They get lost in the shuffle. That's very, very difficult situation. That we've got to do better on. But what's even more confounding, Elizabeth, is that when you have a community-based outbreak, like's going on right now in several states, Florida, California, Texas, Arizona, etc., what you're seeing is community-based spread where 20 to 40% of the people who are infected don't have any symptoms. So the standard classic paradigm of identification, isolation, contact tracing doesn't work no matter how good you are, because you don't know who you're tracing. They're out there, they don't even know that they're infected. So as I mentioned a few times recently, one of the things that we are considering doing is completely blanketing these communities with tests to get a feel for what the penetrance is in the community of infection. You can do that by a number of ways. You can do pooled testing of large numbers of people together in one shot. You can get community people to get boots on the ground and to go out there and look for the people instead of getting on a phone and doing so-called contact tracing by phone.
So maybe going out there and doing contact tracing in person is a better idea.
Exactly.
Can we get this outbreak under control without good contact tracing? I mean, is it going to be possible, or how important is this?
I think contact tracing is one element of a multifaceted response to control. It isn't the only one, but it's an important one.
Tony, do you ever run into people who say to you, I don't know what all this mask stuff is about. I don't know what all this social distancing stuff is about. I'm fine. My family's fine. I'm going to go back out there.
Oh, absolutely. It's understandable. Young people, and I guess I'll say it again. I've said it so many times. is that in all of the years that I've been chasing viruses, I've never seen a situation that could lead to such confusion. Because with the same pathogen, you have 20 to 40% of the people don't even know they're infected. Then you get another proportion that they know they're infected because they have mild symptoms. Then another group that have moderately severe symptoms, they stay home for a week or two or more and don't feel well for another month. Others require hospitalization. Of those, some require oxygen. Of those, some require intubation. Others require ventilation, and some die. So when you have a young person who has little chance, not zero, because young people are getting into trouble too, but have little chance of getting seriously involved, they're saying, what's all the big deal about? I mean, people are getting infected. My friends, I'm in my 20s or whatever, I'm not going to be getting infected. So they do things to propagate the pandemic in an innocent, understandable, but regrettable way. And that is, they don't realize that while they're getting infected, it is likely they're going to infect someone else, who will infect someone else, who ultimately will infect a vulnerable person. And then you have hospitalizations and deaths. So, like it or not, by getting infected yourself, you're not in a vacuum. You're part of the propagation of the dynamics of a pandemic. So you have your own individual responsibility to protect yourself, but you really do have a societal responsibility to be not part of the problem, but to be part of the solution.
The extent to which people are infected but are either asymptomatic or so mildly symptomatic that they don't even realize they have COVID, the extent to which that is happening, has that been a surprise to you over the past few months? Is this unusual?
Oh yeah, it's very unusual to have a disease that kills a reasonably relatively high percentage of the vulnerables, the elderly with underlying conditions, even young people with underlying conditions. That same microbe does absolutely nothing to such a high percentage of people. I don't know any precedent to that. Usually a microbe that's capable of killing you at least makes most of the people sick. That's not the case here. That's very confounding.
Tony Fauci, thank you so much for being with us. We continue to admire your leadership and thank you for everything you've done.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good to be with you.
And now, another big idea from Emma Robbins.
Yad'e. My name is Emma Robbins, and I am the director of the Navajo Water Project. My big idea is that we honor, repair, and modernize every single treaty that has been broken between the United States government and Native nations. And every single treaty has been broken. In the process of honoring these treaties, we need to update them to include utilities like electricity, clean drinking water, and internet, basic necessities that many living on reservations lack. Indigenous peoples would also be compensated retroactively for the air, land, and water that we have lost to pipelines, power plants, and mines. With these funds, we could implement housing, small businesses, and cultural and language revitalization programs to ensure that we can thrive, maintain our resiliency, and truly control our sovereign nations. Thank you.
And welcome back, Kitty Byrne.
Ideas Festival takes place on this beautiful campus in Aspen, where the Aspen Institute was born. But much of the critical work of the Institute is undertaken year-round by our colleagues based in Washington, D.C., in New York, and in affiliates across the globe. The Institute leads a variety of policy programs and initiatives that tackle critical issues of the day, whether it's environment or energy or communications or inequity. I am pleased to introduce Dan Porterfield, our CEO, who's on the ground in D.C., leading our currently remote team of 500 dedicated professionals.
I want to thank you for joining us for the first day of the 2020 Aspen Ideas Festival. We bring you this year's program online, not because we want to, but because we have to. With the COVID-19 pandemic stealing lives and futures and devastating economies all across the planet. Today, our country and our world have reached a crossroads. 4 crises have converged in one period of raw and brutal pain. The worst pandemic since 1918, the weakest economy since the Great Depression, a national reckoning on structural and interpersonal racism in their many forms, and the worst trends in global warming in recorded history. Standing at this crossroads, this intersection of enduring inequities and emerging threats, there are many roads that we could take. One is a stubborn path of willful denial. Others are the forlorn paths of cynicism, of scapegoating, of surrender. But there's one thing we know for sure, and that's that those paths are all dead ends. The only byway that actually goes someplace is the path of humanistic optimism. It comes down to this: we can and must use our core human capacities for love, reason, empathy, and invention to solve problems that we humans have created. And so, in that spirit of humanistic optimism, the Aspen Institute brings you this year's Aspen Ideas Festival, which gathers thinkers and doers who are driving change on today's most urgent challenges. As you've already seen tonight, the ideas expressed here are bold, challenging, relevant, and actionable. They're ideas that matter.
The Aspen Ideas Festival is generously underwritten by Allstate, the Mount Sinai Health System, Prudential, and the Walton Family Foundation, with support from PayPal and the Rise Fund. Thank you for joining us on day one of 5 days of the 2020 Aspen Ideas Digital Festival. Please make sure to join us tomorrow and the following days as we share more conversations, ideas, and inspiration.